with them. Ooh, got it. I have a close partnership with them. We've been working on this project for a few years now, and we're trying to get funding to expand it to make it even bigger. And what we're calling it at the moment is the Wisconsin Statewide Community Science Project. And what it is, as we'll talk about, is a community-based approach to characterizing biodiversity for conservation and education action. And so I'll talk about kind of what that is. But before we get started, I do want to talk about why we're doing it. And so as an insect person, and most of the zoologists at the museum are also insect people, we are really interested in insect diversity as well as kind of the loss of insect diversity. And so starting probably in like 2015, 2016, the fact that insect populations are declining around the world has started to get more and more and more attention. You know, lots of attention has been paid to other taxa, but insects are not only the most diverse group of organisms on the planet, diverse group of multicellular organisms on the planet, but they're also really functionally important. They're important pollinators, predators, and they play really important roles in other ways in ecosystems. And so, you know, if you go back to 2017, this is all from the Washington Post because that's who I have a subscription to, you can start seeing national news stories about studies showing that insects are vanishing. They're vanishing not just from urban areas, which is kind of to be expected, but also from preserves and pristine tropical forests and places around the world where you wouldn't expect insect diversity to decline as severely. And as recently as February in 2023, this year, you're finding that essential insects like pollinators and predators are declining sharply in the last few decades in East Asia. And so all of this has been backed up kind of with scientific research. And so there's lots of causes for why insect populations are declining. So this is a schematic that kind of shows a number of those causes. Fertilizer use can cause insect declines, things like climate change and invasive species, fire, storm intensity, global warming, drought. In an urban area, the things that we most typically think of, so you think of introduced species like introduced predators, or even in some cases in the South, like the fire ant coming in and displacing lots of insects. You have light pollution and chemical pollution really impacting insect populations, and of course urbanization and habitat loss. So the loss and conversion of wooded areas and prairie areas into lawns, which are not great for insect diversity, to lawns, homes, commercial properties, and other things. And so there's a myriad number of reasons that insect populations are declining around the world. Here in Milwaukee, we're kind of focused on the urbanization component. And this has kind of been backed up by scientific studies. So this study from Durzo et al. In 2014 just looked at all the insect population data that were available and just described what % of species that had data available were showing population increases, decreases, or were stable. And so, you know, it really does vary by what kind of insect you're talking about. Beetles are in trouble. You know, about 60% of the populations for which there was enough data available are declining. Ants and wasps and bees seems to be kind of, depending, you know, on what you're talking about, bee populations are in real trouble, as you've probably heard, but a lot of ant populations are probably doing okay. Butterflies, you know, you have some charismatic examples of things like monarchs whose populations are in real trouble. But, you know, for the most part, the majority of butterfly populations, at least for the moment, seem to be okay. But orthopterans like grasshoppers and katydids, they're in real trouble. And that's largely due to habitat loss. Like these are prairie species and grassland species, and most of that habitat is disappearing. So orthopterans, about 100% of all the population data available suggests that those are declining kind of across the world. And so this kind of paints a bleak picture of insect populations are falling apart, we're in real trouble, the world's going to end. But then you also have other studies saying, well, we've surveyed the entire continent of North America, and yes, there might be some local populations going up, going down, but we have not yet also found, we, the science community, has also recently not found no sign of large-scale insect apocalypse, as the study says, in North America just yet. And so this is sort of the problem is, this is kind of how science works, is you have some studies saying this is happening, some studies saying this is happening, and people are like, I just really want to know what's going on. And scientists are equally saying, we also really would like to know what's going on. How can we not know what's going on? And the reason we don't know what's going on, particularly with insects, is because they're widely understudied and undersampled compared to other taxa. So, you know, this is a graph just showing, you can think of this as kind of a reporting schematic. So like green bars are taxa that are really highly reported and well documented, and red bars are taxa for which the distribution and abundance and occurrence is really poorly reported. And so, you know, across different taxa, as you might imagine, birds have an excess of reporting. There's a huge birding community out there, tons of information on bird populations, bird diversity, bird geographic ranges. And so they are really extremely well sampled, and we can make a lot of inference about what is happening with bird populations. Consequently, if you go all the way to the bottom of the list, insects, spiders and insects really, are the two most underreported taxa. And so that underreporting is leading to a lot of this confusion about what is the actual extent of biodiversity loss in insects, which is hard to know because I think a lot of insect species are still even uncharacterized. And so first off, there's how many species even are there and how many of them have been lost, and what are their populations doing? And that's really hard to know without the data to answer those questions. And so that is what this program with the Milwaukee Public Museum is all about. It's like, how do we get enough data, at least within the state of Wisconsin, which I firmly believe to be one of the most diverse states, habitat and fauna, flora and fauna wise in the country. How do we know what's going on in the state? And so the statewide community science project was born, and this was born and created by the Milwaukee Public Museum. And since I happen to be an adjunct curator there, and I'm kind of friends with Jen Zaspel, and as the insect person, I kind of got pulled into it, which I really enjoy. And then it expanded, and partner institutions like University of Wisconsin, Green Bay, the Harbor District here in Milwaukee, the Cable Natural History Museum way up north, and UW Parkside have all joined onto this community science project. And the goal is to understand the diversity of Wisconsin biota, you know, flora and fauna, across the state. And so we can do comparisons like how green space in cities improves insect and plant diversity, what does the urban-rural divide look like, and other important questions that we just like to know, in addition to what's out there, like what is the diversity of Wisconsin? And so, you know, the two main questions we're focusing on are, how do bumblebee and butterfly communities vary in urban and rural sites and in different habitats, and how do these communities change over time? We also want to know how complete our sampling is. It's how good a job are we doing at characterizing the butterfly and bee communities out here. And let's see, we targeted bumblebees and butterflies for two reasons, or for several reasons. There's pre-existing protocols and community science databases. And so these are two kind of charismatic groups. And so there's lots of information from other sources and other organizations. So there is an ability for us to not only add to that information, but to use that information to help us in our studies. And they're really charismatic. Bees and people really like bees and butterflies. very pretty. They're typically, they say they're typically identifiable in the field. Man, I have some trouble, especially with the bees. But they're typically, once you know what you're doing, they're typically identifiable in the field. They are among, if not the single most important pollinators for not just crops, but prairie plants and everything too. They're indicators of environmental heterogeneity. So not only do robust bee and butterfly populations indicate when you have a good environment, but they also change extremely fast when you have a bad environment. And so they're good indicator species for the health of your environment. And they're really important to conserve in Wisconsin. I mean, Wisconsin has 2 endangered species of butterfly and 1 bee that I know of, the rusty patch bee, as well as Carner's blue and the Poweshiek skipperling, are all endangered within Wisconsin. Well, it's unclear if the Poweshiek skipperling is still endangered in Wisconsin or is actually extinct in Wisconsin at this point. So we targeted these 2 groups because they're important, they're charismatic, they're easy to identify, and they're good indicators of environmental health. And so what we've done so far is we've outlined, so this is the Milwaukee portion. I'm not going to really talk about the Cable or the UW Green Bay portion, because what we've done so far in Milwaukee is just kind of identified 2 urban sites. And so this is older. We now have a few more sites, but we have a sample of 4 now distinct trails that we walk. So there's the northern section of the KK Trail, kind of through Walker's Point in the 5th Ward. There's the southern section of the KK Trail. There's now, if you can see my mouse, kind of over here along the riverfront, there's going to be a green space put in. So, you know, they're surveying this area for some before data, and then they're going to put the green space in and survey it for after data. Marquette, which I can talk about afterwards, we just put in a big prairie garden, and so they're surveying our campus for butterfly and bee diversity, and they're also surveying the site of the new museum building, because I think the new museum design is going to incorporate lots of natural landscaping. And so we kind of have these distinct sites. These 2 sites we've actually been surveying for several years now to look at pollinator and plant diversity within the city. And so the first question, you know, so one question is, how complete is our sampling? Are we actually capturing all of the species that are out there? And the truth is kind of, you know, that kind of depends on the site. So at this KK Trail North site, which is kind of looks like this, it's not great habitat. You see that after about 2 weeks of sampling, you've seen about 7 butterfly species, and that's about all you're going to get. It's like 90% cabbage whites with some monarchs mixed in and some other things. Likewise, you know, it takes a while, especially because we start early in the year. So once the weather warms up, and you sample for about 7 weeks, you've got about all the bee species you're going to find along that trail. Conversely, if you go to the southern site, which is actually much better habitat, you also notice there's big parks and it's along the river and things like that. So it's kind of in a better location. They sampled for the entire summer and found no indication that they had come close to capturing all the butterfly species that were out there. And the same is true for the bees. And so even though these 2 sites are right next to each other, one is kind of poor quality habitat in which you very quickly identify all the species that are out there, and the other is much better habitat in which they still don't have a good idea of just how many species are out there. And so the point here is that it could take a lot of sampling to really characterize the diversity of these communities. And for us, with the 2 interns we have, we frankly could use some help. And so if you actually then go look at historical data and say, well, where does that help come from? You know, this graph shows the number of records of occurrences for butterflies over time. And, you know, so historically, records of occurrences were almost entirely dominated by museum collections. It was done by museum researchers and academic researchers going out, collecting specimens, cataloging them, turning them into the museum. But then, I'm not sure what happened in the mid-2000s, but kind of as the internet started taking off, is when community science started taking off. And all of a sudden, people started reporting a whole lot of community data that the museum specimens weren't capturing. And then as museum specimens collecting becomes more and more rare, as museums transition into other kinds of research, now it's the community who is doing the bulk of reporting. And this is great because you can see here, as the era of the Internet of Things takes over, that the community can capture a whole lot more observations because there's just so, there's so many, it takes a village, right? You can capture so many more observations than the museum ever did. And so this is where having the community involved in science and in biodiversity data is super critical and super important for us to understand patterns and diversity in space and time. And so what what Kat did, the graduate student, is actually took like the scientific Pollard Walk database, the community data and museum specimens, and compared, how well do these databases represent each other in terms of what species are seen. And the truth is that the Pollard Walk and the iNaturalist databases appear to be pretty congruent with each other, but the specimen record had a whole lot more species in it than the community data or the scientific survey data. And the reason for that, presumably, is that the specimen records for some species are over 100 years old at the museum. And so I think there's a lot of species the museum is capturing in their specimen collection that are just frankly extinct in Milwaukee these days. And so what we can do now is compare diversity through time. We can start to use these data to compare diversity through time as well. So, just to bring us back home is that we want to know, like, there's a lot of uncertainty here, just how many of these populations are actually decreasing and increasing, what's going on with the diversity, what is the diversity, and we can only do so much, on our own. And that's where we really need your help. We really need the community's involvement in this process. And so that's where this idea for community of science has come from. It's what the museum is currently working on as one of their core goals for the new museum and the new museum's design, is getting the public involved in scientific research, whether it's a local community or a global scale investigation. And community science is literally defined by the fact that it's all done by volunteers. It's non-expert, non-professional scientists, but people who just love getting outside, love nature, want to contribute, and really just find the value in biodiversity and understanding these patterns. And so there's a lot of, I think Tim or Amanda can probably talk more because the UEC does a lot. They do the firefly surveys and other things. So there's a lot of opportunity to do it. And I'm just kind of repeating myself, but I want to stress how important that is and how much we really appreciate your help when you get involved, because your help is crucial to understanding these patterns. And so community science at the Milwaukee Public Museum, these are our partners. So, we partnered up with the Schlitz Audubon, NPM, UW Green Bay, UEC, Harbor District, Parkside, Marquette Cable, and Pollard Base. And the goal of what we're trying to do is to engage the public into the scientific process, engage you all to better understand, appreciate biodiversity, better characterize biodiversity loss and patterns through time. And we have this ultimate vision that will, I pray, be realized one day, for bringing biodiversity data together for the entire state of Wisconsin into an exhibit at the museum that can be used to visualize patterns in biodiversity of numerous taxa for research and education, which that's kind of a different thing that I'm not going to get into today. But ultimately, we're hoping that the museum serves as a hub for all of the professional and community science biodiversity data being collected, so that there's a place where you can go to actually visualize all of this. So then that brings me to, how do you get involved? And it's as easy as going outside and looking at things. That's what it takes. So that's not it. This is I hope you've all heard of iNaturalist. If you haven't, it is a community science platform for logging your observations. You can literally just take pictures of things on your phone. The app will even give you a species identification guess. Say, I think it's this, and it's actually pretty good at it. And so there is a project right now for the Wisconsin statewide community science program. And the project actually has different locations. And so the Cable has their own group. UW Arboretum has their own group. The Coughlin Center at UW Green Bay has got their own like 6 groups. And Milwaukee, MPM, we have our own group. And you can see that across all of these collaborating groups, so far in I think the 2 years they've been doing it, we have collected 5,600, 5,700 observations, have inventoried 1,100 species, and have been helped by about 230 to 250 people. And if you look at just the Milwaukee County one, we can go in here and see that in Milwaukee County alone accounts for 1,400 observations and have identified 145 plant and insect species. I think it's mostly plants and insects, with 80 people helping identify things, but right now we only have 7 observers. And so what you can do is you can actually reach out and request to join this project and then become a member. And just by wandering around Milwaukee, collecting observations, documenting it, uploading it to this project, you are helping characterize Milwaukee biodiversity and helping us understand spatial and temporal patterns and diversity. And so the goal is that by really engaging in the Milwaukee community and having a Milwaukee specific project, we can actually then begin to really get a hold of just the diversity and different locations of our county. And so, you can see that obviously ash, bird's foot trefoil is really common. Sumac is common, but cabbage whites are really common. But we also have odonate surveys, bumblebee surveys. We're going to be adding butterfly, we're going to be adding moths. And so the other way you can help if you're on iNaturalist is to help us go in and actually identify. So if you do know some of these taxa really well, you see most of our observations are just what they call casual observations, or some even need an identification where we had no idea what it was. If you can go in and help us confirm or give suggestions for what the identification might be, that also helps us for observations that have already been taken. So I think the way to join this is you just go to iNaturalist. You can request to join. Kat Sullivan is in charge of this. She should let you in. And then you can become a member of this project and help us characterize the diversity of the county. And that's really kind of my pitch, is that community science is super important. It can reach beyond what we're capable of reaching. Your help